A critical point to understand and realize is the following. What does it mean when I say the Midas HaYichud of each generation? And this is the key point. When we say that Adam Rishon before the Chet had a certain Midas HaYichud, and that the Adam Rishon Achar Chet had a Midas HaYichud, and the next generation, and that the Midas HaYichud changes from each generation, what exactly does it mean, the Midas HaYichud? The Midas HaYichud means a certain aspect of the Bnei Hashem's the Gilui of the Bnei Hashem's Yichud. What it means is the following. The Midas HaYichud of each generation changes, and that becomes the pivot of the Bechir of this generation. In other words, each generation is masik the Yichudoi differently. And as the generations go further and further, the ability of the generation to be masik Yichudoi gets less and less. So the Midas HaYichud is getting small, the clarity is getting less and less in that sense. But in each generation, the quality of that Midas HaYichud is the focus of the Bechir of that generation. Adam Rishon before the Chet had a much greater Midas HaYichud in which to determine yes or no than we do, in that sense. His Midas HaYichud, since it was much higher, that focus, his Midas HaYichud was much higher in terms of the pivot of what his Bechira was. With each succeeding generation, the pivot of the Bechira, or the amount of Midas HaYichud, which that generation has to choose between Yetzer Tov and Yetzer Hara, gets less and less. So the Midas HaYichud determines the pivot of the Bechira, or the amount of Bechira in that generation. Another thing is, it determines also the Teva of that world. And this is a very, very critical thing. The Teva means the actual physical laws and the actual personality of man, the psychological, intellectual, and physical status of the world at that time is determined by the Midas HaYichud. You see, this is a very important thing. Adam Rishon before the Chet was in a condition of the world where he never died. There was no Misa. Obviously, the physics of his world, his intellect, his entire personality was nothing like we know of in normal human terms. You see, the Teva, the laws, the natural laws of his world, of his Olam Hazeh, had no shaykhs to our world. What determined that? The Midas HaYichud. Since that world had a certain level of Midas HaYichud in terms of the Bechira, then that very Midas HaYichud was the thing which designed the particular Teva of the world at that time. Later on, after Adam Rishon, we see that people lived 700 years, 500 years, 1,000 years, or whatever the story was. Well, what's the nature of a person? What is the personality of a person who knows that he can live for 750 years normally? You see, what kind of psychological state is he in, or intellectual state? Obviously, the entire thing is different. His growth process, the biological maturation, you see, the physical maturation, his intellectual maturation, the development of his personality is obviously at a totally different rate and a totally different pace. You see, when you know that you're old, from a childhood to adulthood or to death is 750 years, then when it's only from 70 years. So therefore we see that the Midas HaYichud actually determines the Teva of the Bria at that time. And that's why we all make a very big mistake if we think that the Doros HaKadmonim are like us. We think that we compare ourselves to the Doros HaKadmonim like Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. When Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov lived, literally, the human experience was different than us. We are not the same human beings as they were. This sounds astonishing because we assume that the way we are now is absolute. It always was the same way. That's not true. Man as an entity, man as a biological, psychological, intellectual, and spiritual entity has undergone transformation from one generation to another. So that the man as he was by Adam Rishon, and man as he was by the Dor Mabul, and man as he was by the Dor HaFloga, and then later on by the Ovis, and by Chris, and by the Yetzias Mitzrayim, they were distant people. They were not the same people as us. It's a totally different thing. What determined that? The type of Teva, the Midas HaYichud. When there was a great Midas HaYichud, when the pivot of Bechira of that time was based on a Midas HaYichud, when there was a great deal of Gilui, it meant that the Teva of the Bria had to support that level of Gilui Yichud. So therefore, in those days there was Nevi'us, there was Mofsim, there was all kinds of things that don't exist anymore. What kind of person is it that lives every day and sees Mofsim and sees Nevi'us? You see, it's a whole different society. We can't understand that. Our personalities are totally different. The fundamental rule, and this is what's very important, is that the Midas HaYichud of that generation determines the quality of the Bechira of that generation. It also determines the nature of the reality and the human condition or the human experience which is necessary to support that Bechira process. And what we know very carefully is that just like the Midas HaYichud undergoes transformation from every generation, in the sense that it gets lower and lower to greater and greater Hester, the Teva itself changes constantly. You see, so that man and his human experience changes midor achar dor. We as human beings are not the same as human beings who even lived 2,000 years ago and what their experience was like. It's a totally different situation. The type of Midas HaYichud which exists in that generation also determines the Gila level. It determines the level in which a person will be Masig Yechudai, obviously. Those generations there was Nevi'us. People at that time were much closer to the Koyach, to the Bria. That's why in those times they had Nevi'us and they had Kishuv and so on. Because at those times they knew how to access the Koyachas which are at the Pnimius of the Bria. They knew how to access Ruchnius much more directly than we do. We can't access Ruchnius anymore. We can only access Gashmius and in a certain sense try and see the Ruchnius in great levels of Gashmius. We don't have that ability anymore. The Doros HaKadmonim, they were able to access Ruchnius much closer. That's why they had tremendous koiches of Kedusha, Moifsim and Nisim and Kishuv at the same time. Because they were able to access it. Why were they able to access? Because the Bechira at that time was much higher. Since the Bechira involved a Midas HaYichud, which is much greater, the Gila Yichud was much greater, their ability to perceive Ruchnius was much greater. You see, so their Gila level was much greater, they can access a much higher level of Ruchnius. And therefore, the very teva of their reality was different. Because it indicated and showed immediately Ruchnius was much closer to their reality than to us. Their life, their constant day-to-day existence was very, very close to Ruchnius. Well, you may say, but in those days were all of Avodah Zorah. But that's exactly the point. Their Avodah Zorah was Ruchnius. The fact that all the people at that time were into Avodah Zorah, their Avodah Zorah was actually real. It was a real koyach at that time. And it was a real koyach of Tumah, a real koyach of Kishuv and so on. It was something that we don't have today. Because the people at that time had a much greater taiva for Ruchnius than we have now. And because they had a much greater taiva of Ruchnius, you see, and they were much closer to Ruchnius, the Ruchnius which presented to them was much more Megula, much open. So therefore, the Baruch Shem either presented very powerful Kedusha or very powerful Tumah. Either they were Bala Avodah Zorah into Kishuv and all these things, where they can actually do all kinds of moisim with the Derech HaTumah, or they went to Kedusha and Nevi'us and tremendous things moisim. You see what I'm saying? Since their Midas HaYichud was much greater at that time in terms of the pivot of Bechira, it was much greater in terms of their closeness to Ruchnius itself. Hence, the reality was totally different. You see, their reality supported an incredible attachment and proximity to Ruchnius. So therefore, they experienced koiches that we have no shaykhs anymore. They can only read the stars. They knew the true chokhmah of astrology, the true chokhmah of Kishuv, the true chokhmah of all these inyanim. They were able to do it. Like it says by Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Egyptian magician were able to do all the things Moshe basically would do up to the first couple of bakas. They also could throw down a staff and make a snake. What's the big deal?
I heard it was just
you see. So in other words, at that time, the fact that they could take a matzah and make a snake out of it, or they could raise the frogs, the Egyptians themselves could have turned the entire Nile into blood. And that was real blood. The magicians of Mitzrayim found it very easy to convert the entire Nile into human blood, into blood. That's a staggering feat. How are they able to do that? What kind of koyach allows such a thing? Obviously, they were familiar with the koyach of Ruchnius. But since they chose a Yeshid Mavada, they chose to follow the Yitzhak in terms of the Gaiva, they therefore were able to access Ruchnius in terms of its koyach HaTumah. But they still were close to the koyach HaTumah. So obviously their whole reality was totally different than ours. You see? And then finally, because of the fact that their Bechira had a much higher level of Midas HaYichud, the reality had a high level of Yichud, their Gila and everything, the Hanhoga which the Baruch Shem put on them was a different Hanhoga than now. Since the Bechira involved much greater levels of Ruchnius and so on, the Hanhoga of the Baruch Shem on them in terms of the Mishpat and the Din was much severer in a way. You see? So it's a whole different thing. So in other words, when I say Midas HaYichud, I'm referring to a number of different characteristics. Midas HaYichud, the Midas HaYichud that's revealed in each generation refers to the specific, the quality of Bechira in that generation, to the nature of the reality which supports that Bechira, to the level of Gilui Ruchnius in terms of the closeness of that generation to Ruchnius at that time, and also to the way the Banishim was manig the Bria in terms of the force of din and the force of chesed that he brings down. All these things are subsumed under the concept of Midas HaYichud. And every generation had a different level of Midas HaYichud. Adam Rishon started with the highest level of Midas HaYichud, and later on it kept on going down and down. And as the Midas HaYichud changes from each generation, it means that the human experience changes from each generation. That there's an actual transformation in mankind himself. The Min Enushi actually undergoes transformations midor achador. And this is very critical to understand in terms of Midas HaYichud. Now, one more thing that I would like to say, and this is the thing. We therefore understand that this is the thing. We understand that each generation has a certain Midas HaYichud, which determines the Bechir of that generation and so on. Fine. But the truth of the matter is, what determined initially what the Midas HaYichud would be of Adam Rishon? In other words, the Banishim started out with a certain level of Chassan. What determined that level of Chassan? That's number one. And once Adam Rishon did the Chet, what happened was that the Midas HaYichud went down to a new level. What determined that new level? In other words, what is the mechanism which determines exactly what level of Midas HaYichud we will start with, and what the subsequent transformations of that Midas HaYichud are to the end of time, until down to the 6,000 years. Another way of saying it is the Banishim said that the world will last 6,000 years. In other words, from the time of Adam Rishon before the Chet to the Chet itself, it must happen within 6,000 years. That means that the Midas HaYichud can only undergo transformations within 6,000 years. That means again that each generation must see a certain amount of transformation of the Midas HaYichud as it goes on from Dor Achad Dor. But obviously the whole thing is predetermined in some way. There's an exact predetermination or design exactly how much of the Midas HaYichud will exist in each generation. Now, what is totally in Bechira is whether or not there will be a new Midas HaYichud. That's totally in Bechiras Adam. In other words, what happens is whether or not one generation will go on to the next generation, and there will be a transformation of the Midas HaYichud, depends on the Bechira of that generation. It is the Bechira of mankind which determines whether or not there will be a transformation of Midas HaYichud, Midor Achador. But the amount of that transformation, how much that midah will start with, and how much it will change from each generation, so that generation fail, is not determined by Bechira. You see, Bechira simply moves it along, but how fast it moves along, you see, its rate, its quality, its quantity, these criteria have no shaycha to the Bechira of Adam. These things are determined from the Bonish himself. Well, the question is, what is the mechanism and what is the chokhmah involved in that? What I just told you now, which is fundamentally this kind of thing, comes into a whole different area. And when the Ramchal refers to this, he says, Goda Chokhmasai. In other words, the truth of the matter is, we don't know. We do not know. Nobody knows exactly what Chokhmah the Banishim used, what criteria, what principles, what seidus, what he uses in order to judge how he's going to start the thing from Adam Rishon, and how each generation will wind up with what level of Midas HaYichud, and why the whole thing must take only 6,000 years, no more. You know, why didn't the Banishim make it for 10,000 years? Well, the truth of the matter is, if the Banishim had extended it for 10,000 years, if that would have been the case, obviously it would have been possible that the Midas HaYichud would not have been so transformed. You see, it would have been a slower process. Once you set the entire tikkun of the Bria for 6,000 years, you've already set exactly how many generations there will be and the level of Midas HaYichud for each generation. It's already determined, you see. Now, what moves it along is the Bechira of man. But the ultimate question is, what determined the whole design of the Bria in the first place? Why 6,000 years? Why does the Midas HaYichud have this particular transformation in each of these generations? Why is it? What determines the original Midas HaYichud in Olam Haba? Olam Haba has a certain Midas HaYichud. Why that Midas HaYichud? Why not a higher one? You see, why not a lower one? In other words, you see what I'm saying? The mechanics or the fundamental chokhmah which is involved in the inner design of the Bria is called Goda Chokhmasai. And no man has ever known this. Please. All our chokhmah, everything that we try and understand, can barely make us understand within that how one generation moves and why everything happens within the movement of history. In other words, it's all our koiches just to understand the hashkaka process as we flow through the flow or the movement of history. But No one has ever been able to understand what determined the specific stations or states of history itself. That's something which is part of the design of the Bria. So, we see therefore that there are two fundamental things which are even higher than what we've said. Up to now we've always said that there's two midas that come from the Bnei Shem. The Hanugas HaYichud, and the Hanugas HaMishpat, and the Hanugas HaYichud. And all of these attempt to go to a certain goal. But the truth of the matter is, there is another Hanhoga that comes out from the Bnei Shem, which surpasses and is beyond all of these things. It is the Hanhoga of the ultimate design, the Hanhoga HaChochma of the Bnei Shem himself. And that Hanhoga determines exactly how the Hanugas HaMishpat will act at any point in time, how the Hanugas HaYichud will act at any point, what the Hanugas HaMishpat will set as the starting frame for the Midas HaYichud, and how the Hanugas HaYichud will constantly change that. You see, that's it. But the ultimate Chochmah, which is the ultimate design, is a certain Hanhoga, is a certain meat of the Bnei Shem, which is even higher than this. That is a level of Hasogas Yehuda, which is greater. If you are Masig Yehuda, if you reach the Madrega of understanding the Madinyan of Hanugas HaYichud, if you understand the Inyan of Oidach Hashem cannot to be, how the Ra itself has the essence of Toiv. If we reach this highest Madrega and we understand all the activities of history, we have still only reached the doorstep of understanding why was all human history designed this way in the first place, not the flow, but rather the static points, you see. That goes on to a whole new midah called the Chochmas HaBorei. The question is, will we ever be able to be zocheh to that, either as a group or as a chidam? Will Moshe Rabbeinu, will the Mashiach ever be zocheh to that Chochmah? I can't answer that. I really don't know. The truth is, I don't know. But we see clearly that there's a madrega of Yichud, which is even higher than everything we see to now. That the mitzvah Yichud, which starts from Adam Rishon and so on, is so vast that it will allow us to understand every event that ever took place. But there is another level of Yichud even behind that, which could allow us to understand why everything was designed like this in the first place. Now, where does that Midas HaYichud, where does the Midas HaYichud of the Chochmas HaBorei exist? You see, it depends. If that Midas HaYichud exists before the first level of creation, right, between the first Zuratzoi, it means that it's with the Bnei Shem himself in his own bosom, as to say, and we will never know that. But if that level of Midas HaYichud exists after, you see, if it's that, then we are Shayach to that. And the truth is, I'm not clear where that is. It's very difficult to answer. But it's important to understand that there are two distinct aspects of Midas HaYichud. There's the Midas HaYichud of the Bnei Shem in himself, in his own soid, in his own, in terms of his own reasons for designing the Bria, and then there's the Midas HaYichud as it manifests itself b'Ritzonai, in the Bria itself. That mankind will be zoch to know in Olam Haba to the fullest extent. However, will mankind ever be zoch to know the Inyan of Chochmas HaBorei itself? Why the Bnei Shem made the Bria like this in the first place? You see, why Olam Haba had exactly this Midas Yichud, no more, no less? Why Adam started out with this Yichud, no more or less? Why the Dor HaMabul had that Yichud, and so on and so forth? Why the world is 6,000 years? Will mankind be zoch to know this? The level of Yichud that involves this. Now, remember, this also involves the Midas HaYichud of the Borei. Because all these criteria of design are all part and parcel of the Yichud HaBorei itself. But I don't know. Will mankind be zoch to that? I don't know. It depends if that Midas HaYichud is a part of Atzmusai or if it's part of Ritzonai. If that Midas HaYichud is a part of Atzmusai, it's him. We will never know it. But if it's part of Ritzonai, it's a part of that which is Megala to us, his Ratzon, that we will know. But I'm not clear on that. But it's good for you to know some possible objectives to at least one of each. And I suspect possibly that if we can even understand such a thing and even be curious about it, it is maybe possible that maybe we can come on to certain levels of design. You see, I don't know. And the question is, will certain individuals, would the Mashiach be zocheh to that higher level, this and that? It's very, very hard to say. One thing I just want to clarify is this kind of thing. You might say, well, the Midas HaYichud, the amount of hester of the Midas HaYichud is determined by man's actions. Why? Because the more Chatoima does, the bigger hester he brings. That is true. As a person does more chatoim, so therefore he brings on greater and greater hester. And in a certain way he does control the amount of hester which will exist in the next generation. However, what he cannot determine is the fundamental unit of exchange. In other words, if a person does one chet, how much hester does he bring in because of that chet? You see, he brings in a certain amount of hester. But then, what determines the amount of hester that one chet should bring in? Why shouldn't that one chet bring in a larger piece of hester? Or less? This we don't know. This is what I mean by Gozach HaKamasai. The Baruch Hu himself determined that a particular chet will cause a certain amount of hester. Now, quantitatively, the more chatoim you do, the more hester you do. In that sense, man has control. But nobody has control over the original exchange unit itself, of how much chet will bring in how much hester, and how much mitzvah will bring in how much giloi. The fundamental unit of exchange is determined by Gozach HaKamasai. The quantity of those units is determined by Bechira, in that sense. But that's an important chilek to understand. One more thing I'd like to conclude is the following. When we say the Midas HaYichud, there's an interesting thing. The Midas HaYichud refers to a certain aspect of how much Yichud Avodah is nigla and so on. Now the interesting thing is, each Midas HaYichud, or each Midas level HaYichud is determined by a certain Shem of the Bnei Shalom. That's what it corresponds to. So therefore, when it says over there, for example, that certain names of the Bnei Shalom were known in certain generations, and certain were not. For example, when Moshe said, by Keil Shaka and so on, that certain names were known and certain names were not, that the others knew certain names and we don't, this is what it's really referring to. What the Buddha is really saying is, my name, my Shem, is nothing more than my Yichud, my Midas HaYichud. And in every generation there's a different Midas HaYichud, so therefore in every generation, a different name of mine is sholet on the Bria, in the sense that a different name of mine corresponds to the particular Midas HaYichud in which I manifest in that generation. You see, that's what it means. So the whole fundamental thing is really nothing more than the constant transformation of Shemus. You see, in a certain way. Api Kabbalah, that's how they would learn it. And they would learn it Api Kabbalah, that in any generation they would understand what was the shame of the Bnei Shalom that was Moshe in that time. But that name is really the Gilui of the Midas HaYichud at that point, you see. Now that itself is the whole Chochmah itself. How the names of the Bnei Shalom correspond to Midas HaYichud. But that's really what it is, you see. But basically what I want to say is that Midas HaYichud is really a basic, a part and parcel of the Yichud HaBoreh itself, what he wants to reveal to that generation. And that Midas HaYichud, that amount of manifestation of Yichud, is represented by different Shemus, in that sense. So this is another aspect of the thing itself. What I did fundamentally now is to show the following, is that up to now we've always said that the fundamental aspect of the Bria is the Hanogas HaMishpat and Hanogas HaYichud. These two are the two fundamental Hanogas that come out of the Ratzon HaBoreh, in that kind of sense. But what we've done now is to give it a little deeper meaning in that sense. That the Hanogas HaMishpat itself, which determines the various parameters of the Bria, it determines how much Chet will produce how much Kilkul, and how much Mitzvah will produce how much Schus. It determines how much schus will produce what chelik in olam haba, and so on and so forth. All this is done by the Hanogas HaMishpat, you see. And the Hanogas HaYichud constantly attempts to deal with that in some way for each generation. And what we see is the following, that the Hanogas HaMishpat itself, and the Hanogas HaYichud itself, and the Trei Mashiachim, which symbolizes this entire tikkun process, is really controlled by a more fundamental thing, which is called the Chochmas HaBoreh. That the Hanogas HaMishpat and the Hanogas HaYichud itself have an inner design, which is controlled and determined by a level of Yichud which is even beyond them. You see. So when I said last time, I've said many times, that the fundamental Zach in the Bria is a tikkunim, is a tikkun of the Trei Mashiachim, of the union of David and the union of Yosef, which is the union of the Hanogas HaMishpat and the Hanogas HaYichud, and the union, for example, of the tikkun of the Zoyman, the tikkun of the Chson. We always presented this as a full picture, but the truth of the matter, this is not the full picture. There yet remains a complete, vast part of the picture, which is even beyond that, which is what determines the particular design and the particular constants in which the Bria is always focused on in its Hanogas HaMishpat, in its Hanogas HaYichud, in its Midas HaYichud of its generation, in the amount of time which is set aside for the entire world Olam Haba to reach the Tikkun, which is 6,000 years, and so on and so forth. There is another aspect called the Midas HaChochmas HaBoreh, which is the union of Gozach HaKamasai itself. What we see from all this is an interesting piece of information, that if we would understand not necessarily the chokhmah, the design of the chokhmah, but if we would understand very carefully the Hanagas HaMishpat and the Hanagas HaYichud, and if we would understand exactly the constants which every generation has in terms of its mitzvah HaYichud until the year 6000, we could actually predict when the case would happen. Because we would know. We would know all the variables which are involved. In other words, we would simply say, wait, we know that if generation 12 misses the boat, and you have to go on to generation 13, if we know clearly the whole lineage of Hanagas HaMishpat and Hanagas HaYichud, we could predict exactly what generation 13 would look like. We would know exactly what Midas HaYichud it would have. Therefore, we would know exactly what its Bechir would be. We would know what its Nisyonis would be, the kinds of Nisyonis that would be presented to it. We would be able to predict exactly and understand the nature of the reality at that time. We would know its Gila level, and we would know exactly the Anhaga of the Bonisham towards that door. We would know this even before it ever happened, if we understood this. That's how exact and precise this is. You see, the only thing that we could not predict is what the Bechira. We cannot say that generation 12 will go on to generation 13, because Hakol B'nei Shemayim Chutz Me'ir Shemayim. That depends on the Bechira of man. The flow depends on the Bechira. But we could say, should it go on, we know exactly what the status of generation 13 will be. 14, 15, down the line, and we therefore would know exactly what the status of the case would be, as well as we would know exactly when it would be as well. You see, so therefore the case is a simple outgrowth of a clear knowledge of the Hashkoch itself, and that can be known exactly. What cannot be known is how far the Bria will go from the time of Adam Rishon, right? If you're standing at that point in time, how far is it going to go? You see, that you don't know. Because we don't know. But you see, in case it goes to that far, in case it goes from Adam Rishon until down to the case, you see, all this has been already designed before. When the Baruch made the Bria, you see, he made it up with Midas HaChetzed and Midas HaDin and Rachmanis. Right? Hashem and Hakim, when it says over there that he created with 2 Midas, the Baruch already pre-designed exactly what the Bria would look like at every point in time, should the Bria go up to that point in time. It doesn't necessarily have to go. You see, and that thing. That's why it says in Pirkei Avos, I think Rabbi Kiva says, Hakol Sofoi, everything is foreseen. Our creation is just the other, but man has total free will. How can everything be seen and be filled? Well, fundamentally, one of the ways to look at it is that everything is it's clearly known and established what every generation will look like until the end of time. Should it go to the end of time? Whether it will go depends on man's movement. But the truth of the matter is, when it said Hakol Sofoi, it really means that the Baruch even knows the future, whether or not we'll go to the end of time. But that's another kasha that we dealt with a long time ago in terms of his knowledge of predestination and so on. But this is the point. What we see clearly from here is that the Hashkocha Protis is an exact science. It's an exact science, and the entire Hashkocha Protis is run on the union of what's called Elokim. In other words, it's run on exact teva, of exact law and order, in such a way that if we knew those Seidas, we would know exactly all of human history from beginning to end, and we could have predicted in advance.
What level is it? Really cool.
Okay, what we're going to continue now is the Kufa, again, of the Mashiach ben Yosef, and let's conclude this, let's see where we can take this to its conclusion. We analyze the whole meaning of the koyach of Mashiach ben Yosef and the unique koyach in terms of the chokhmah that he possesses and the eitzes that he will be able to give. Now, once the Gilu of the Mashiach ben Yosef takes place in Klal Yisrael, it's Nik in Klal Yisrael, and like we said, it's Klal Yisrael has experienced also a hashpah in which to recognize him. What will happen next? Okay, now what we have is, again, we have the state where the Mashiach ben Yosef is already revealed and to Klal Yisrael, and the period is essentially will have been considered to have started. We're into the Kufa of the Mashiach ben Yosef. We're really into it now. Now, over a period of time, gradually, there will be a greater and greater hashpah, and what will happen is that there's going to be a greater and greater turbulence in Klal Yisrael among the Ummah Ha'olam. Fundamentally, the function of the Mashiach ben Yosef at that time will begin to do two things. To raise the Yeruchnistika level of Klal Yisrael to a level of Hasagas Yechudai, to Mekayim the Pasuk of Molo Deis Hashem Kamayim Niyam Chasim, to begin to give every Yid an understanding of what Yiras Shamayim is, and to make him into a Yiras Shamayim. That's number one. And number two, to be Mekabel Golius. This is the essential objective of this Tekufa. So that the ultimate goal is to get all the Jews of the world, every Jew in the world, into Eretz Yisrael, living in Eretz Yisrael, in a position or in a state of mind where everyone will be a very high in Yiras Shamayim and an Atzogas HaTorah. This is fundamentally his purpose. And these will therefore be the two objectives that will emanate from him. How the two objectives will emanate from him is not clear. At least it's not clear to me. But fundamentally these are the two objectives. Obviously, the aspect of Kibbutz Golius depends on two basic prerequisites. One, that Klal Yisrael wants to go to Eretz Yisrael, and number two, that they'll be able to get out of the Ummah Ha'olam without any problems. Those are the two fundamental difficulties. The main activity of the Mashiach ben Yosef will be in the early part of his career, if I may call it a career, is to create the Das, to be Megala the Torah, the Pnimius HaTorah, the Chochmas HaTorah and the Kedusha, which will raise Klal Yisrael out of its klipa and into a level of very high madrega ruchnius. That will be the central effort. Once that has been achieved to a certain level, you see, the next step of Kibbutz Golius starts. I don't imagine that the step of Kibbutz Golius starts immediately. It cannot start, because Klal Yisrael has to be meichen up to a certain level of Yiras Shamayim to suddenly want to pick themselves up and begin to go. So it will take a certain amount of time in terms of that. Once the Mashiach ben Yosef is able to raise the consciousness of Klal Yisrael in terms of making every Yid an Elech Yid, a Yiras Shamayim, and being Megala the kind of the awe, that awe which will slowly begin to reveal itself in the entire world in a very powerful form, the Or Agonas, ultimately, which is not in its beginning phases. The next step is to work on Kibbutz Golius. And this is a very difficult step. Because even though Klal Yisrael wants to go out, correct? Who says the Goyim will let them go? Now, the Goyim in America is one thing. But the Goyim, let's say in Russia, in many of the countries of the world where they're still Rishoyim in that kind of sense, it will be very difficult. But what will happen is, a very interesting thing, that the koyach of the ruchnius will be so powerful from the Mashiach and from Klal Yisrael itself, is that the Goyim will fundamentally stand aside. Because what will probably happen, which I believe will happen, is that, as I explained before, that just like there be a hashpor of Klal Yisrael to sensitize them to ruchnius, there will also begin to be a hashpor on all the Ummah Ha'olam to sensitize them to ruchnius also. Except that the sensitization will be somewhat differentiated. But the Goyim or the Ummah Ha'olam will also have a sensitization that there's a very powerful ruchnistic event happening over here. And what will happen is they will step aside, basically. And in their stepping aside, we're dealing with the hakora that the Goyim will have about the entire Messianic process. Now, the question is, will they just step aside voluntarily, or will there have to be certain coercive measures taken? This is difficult to say, because we find that in Yetzias Mitzrayim, there have to be very powerful coercive measures taken. You see. But the Yetzias Mitzrayim is not exactly the same over here as the Gula Asida. It's not exactly the same. The Klippa, in a sense, which is holding the evening Yetzias Mitzrayim, was greater than the Klippa, which is holding, for the simple reason that it was more an inyan of an Achishena, in a certain sense. Then it was much more of a thing of Achishena, and the truth of the matter is, the Yidden were being Zercha, the Yidden were being Nigal and Nisan. Is here. Nisan is a month of Chesed. The midah that rules Nisan is Chesed. Tishrei is Din. Right? We have Yom Kippur and so on. There's a machlokes in the Gemara of when the Gula Asida will happen, in Tishrei or Nisan, between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua, I believe. Rabbi Yeshua says that the Gula Asida will happen in Tishrei, and Rabbi Eliezer, I believe it's Rabbi Eliezer, says that the Gula Asida will happen in Nisan. What's the machlokes? Fundamentally, what the machlokes appears to be is whether or not the Yidden will be Zoicha to the ultimate case, b'schus or b'chesed. Actually, whereas in Tishrei is the mitzvah din. If Klal Yisrael is Zoicha to the Gula Asida b'achishena b'din, there'll be nigal in Tishrei. But if they're not zoicha to that, then they'll be nigal and Nisan, because Nisan is the man of chesed. The mazel of Nisan is the ram, the ayal, and the ayal is symbolic of the Akedah Yitzchak, which is mamshich, the rachamim of the Bonishom in that kufa. So that's the thing. The Gula Rishonah took place in Nisan, which means that even though it was a very heavily a period of Achishena still, Vahalaya is an Achishena because it failed. Only an Achishena can fail. A Be'ita cannot fail. You see, the Kate Achron cannot fail. Only other Katesim before. So that therefore was an Achishena, but even though it was an Achishena, there was a vast amount of chesed that was also used. Why? Because of the fact that it occurred in Nisan, and it was very, very difficult to get him out of that klipa. Why was it so schwer with 10 makas to bombard the Mitzrayim with 10 makas? Because of the fact that was such a powerful Achishena. So the Kittu was still extremely powerful. That's why. You see. However, the Gula Asida, it's a different situation. If Chayil Yisrael is Zoich in the Gula Asida, the Gula will take place in Tishrei. Now, if they're not Zoich, it will take place in Nisan. In that way. And if it takes place in Nisan, it's also Toleh and Chesed, in that sense. However, since we're talking about a case which happens be case Achon because of Lamani, because of totally of Chesed, come out totally of Chesed, without Chusim, by the point of time that will have been reached, the Ketrugim will most have been gone, just by what Klal Yisrael worked out through the entire thousands of years of Golas. Hazorim Bedina, the Bedima, Berini Yitzoro. What Klal Yisrael was Zorea, was sound in Bedima with tears, Berini Yitzoro, that the Golas, and the tears of Golas, had the koyach to bring Mamas Yeshua a ktsila, a harvest. It wasn't stam b'chinam in vain. You see. So by the time they get to the end, the Gula will be in Nisan. However, even though it's in Nisan, it will not have the severity of the makas that was necessary. That's what I personally feel, and this is the reason why I feel that. So therefore, obviously, the Mashiach ben Yosef, in contending with the Ummah Ha'olam, especially Russia, and the authoritarian countries and so on, the dictatorship and so on, will not have to deal with such a thing. But that the sensitization itself will be powerful enough, in essence, to have the Goyim more or less move aside. You see, there may be a certain amount of opposition and antagonism. And how that we dealt with is not clear. But fundamentally, I believe that Kibbutz Golis itself will really take place because of a certain kind of thing that never took place before. You see, like I say, the Goy Mikeh of Goy, the removal of the Yidden in Mitzrayim, was fundamentally a very powerful separation process, a very painful and excruciating separation process of the Kedusha from the Klippa, from the Tum itself. Very difficult, very arduous, you see. But in the Asad Lava, it will not be. It will be much less painless, it will be much quicker in that sense. And it will be accomplished by something which was not accomplished in the Gula Rishonah. The Gula Rishonah did not involve sensitization by the Mitzrayim to what was going on. They fought at every measure. In the end, there will be a sensitization of the Goyim to the process, and they themselves, in a certain way, will contribute to it and actually participate in this kind of thing. So therefore, Esav, who is the fundamental Ikov, will more or less stand aside to a certain extent, relatively, and the process will take place. Now, when the process takes place, all the Yidden will pick themselves up and go to Eretz Yisrael, because they will want to go to Eretz Yisrael. Why? Because the Makor, the Shurish of the Argonas, will come from Eretz Yisrael itself. That's where it will be in its most powerful form. Therefore, you could no longer hold the Jew back from going here than if you said to the Jew, hey, if you go to Eretz Yisrael Yerushalayim, I will give you $50 million. Now, what Jew is going to stay in America if he knows that as soon as he puts his feet in Eretz Yisrael, he's going to be richer by $50 million? That same taiva, the same Slavos, so that kind of Yerusha, that kind of Gmor will be in the Eden, except it will be Ruchnius. That will be the taiva of Ruchnius. Hinei Yomim Boim, Anu Hashem, Yeshvov V'Tzomei V'Lo Yvov L'Moyim L'Lechem V'Lo Tzomei L'Mayim Ele Kidim L'Dvar Hashem. There will come a time when everyone will be mitzaveh after the emes, a taiva gomor, and that taiva will be satisfied in Eretz Yisrael. Kimitzion, says the Torah. The Torah, which is the Or Chodesh al Tzion Torah. Where will that Or Chodesh be? Where is it going to come from? Al Tzion Torah. That Or Chodesh is the Or Adonis, is the Orish of Mashiach, Al Tzion. That's its Makor. You see, Kimitzion, says the Torah. Dvar Hashem Yerushalayim. It's in Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim becomes the chief city in the world, where Ruchnius will be exported. You see. But that's fundamentally where it's manufactured, that's fundamentally where it is produced and understood. So everyone will, all the Jews will run. The Goyim likewise will also like to go to Israel, but they will not be able to go there. Because they will realize that their tachlis and their inyan lies in the Chutz La'aretz itself. After the Yidden are in Eretz Yisrael, and there's a Kibbutz Goliath, there will be a Yosafah, a tremendous Yosafah of Ruchnius, and they will become established the state of Israel again in Ruchnistic term. You see, the Malchus itself of Klal Yisrael will not be restored yet. That won't happen until the Mashiach ben David. But the Medina of Eretz Yisrael, with its manhig, the Mashiach ben Yosef, will be restored. When I say the union of Kibbutz Goliath, I mean in a very large way. Involved in the Kibbutz Goliath will also be the Asaras HaShvatim. The 10 lost tribes will also be involved in Kibbutz Goliath. The Mashiach ben Yosef will know where those 10 tribes are, and he will restore them to the Kibbutz Goliath. And they will become part and parcel of Klal Yisrael, so that all of the Klal Yisrael will be restored to its Yud Beis Shvatim. It's Shvatim as originally. Another thing that will be restored are the Kelim of the Beis HaMikdash. And many of these things will also be restored.
Did you mention
once the Yidden are now in Eretz Yisrael, in a Medina which fundamentally functions according to the rules of the Torah, with the Mashiach ben Yosef being the manhig, what happens then? Now starts the fireworks. The sensitization which has come down to the world is differentiated. It means that the sensitization was such that it comes down to different people in different ways depending on their madrega. So the different ummas of Olam receive it in a different way. Fundamentally, the sensitization will differentiate Esav itself in different ways. In the sense that there will be parts of Esav that will allow the Yidden to go out and go back to Israel. Most of the world will be at a level where basically the sensitization will make them aware to what's going on. However, there will be a certain class of Goyim who will not respond to that sensitization at all because of the nature of their neshama. Because of that, they will see everything that's going on, you see, in a very threatening way, and they will attempt to destroy it. They will instinctively realize that something very important is happening, which will in the end become catastrophic to their ability and their power to be shoilet on the world itself. Who are these people and what are they called? They are referred to as Gog Umogog. Gog, from the land of Magog. Fundamentally, this is Amalek and certain of the Ummas Olam from Esav, who will arise and attempt to completely undo what has been accomplished by the Mashiach ben Yosef, number one, and to destroy the Mashiach ben Yosef, number two, and re-exile all of Klal Yisrael among the Goyim. That Gog. Who will be involved in this effort? Basically, what will be involved in this effort, I believe, are three constituents. First and foremost, this effort will become involved is Amalek. The classic enemy of all Ruchnias. But Amalek itself is weak. Amalek itself cannot do this kind of thing. Because since the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, when he had a battle with the Amalekim, he weakened them, so that all they can do is be mashpia on someone else to destroy Jews. Amalek itself really doesn't have the koyach to destroy Jews. We once spoke about this a long time ago. So they will become leaders. They will be the mashpiyim, become leaders. And I gave the example in the Hitler in Germany of the Third Reich, the SS and the heads of the Nazis, the head of the thing, the Wehrmacht, the SS, the Gestapo. These were the actual Amalekim who were mashpiyah completely and controlled Germany in terms of this thing. But fundamentally, the Rishoyim is Amalek itself. Amalek will attempt to be mashpiyah on his brother Esav to do this, and they will be mashpiyah on the Erev Rav. And here will be a critical thing. There will be many Jews themselves who will go over and band and go together with Gog. You see, and the head of the Erev Rav, who will do that, who will join together with Amalek, or the group term, the comprehensive term called Gog or Magog, is called, his name is Amalus. Amalus HaRasha. That's his name. He is the chief of the Erev Rav. And he will get together with Amalek, and certain of the ummahs from Esav and attempt to undermine and undo what has been done by the Mashiach ben Yosef. This is a war called Milchemes Gog and Magog. Now remember very carefully, Milchemes Gog and Magog is not a war that will take place before the Mashiach comes. Most people don't understand it. Most people think that there's going to be a very big war in the time of the Mashiach. A lot of people know that because, they call that in English Armageddon. The famous term Armageddon. That the last great battle and so on. But most people think that battle will take place right before the Mashiach comes. That's a toss. That battle, which is the Milchemes Gog and Magog, will take place after the Mashiach has come. The battle of Gog and Magog is the battle against the Mashiach ben Yosef and the Bnei Shalom. You see. So therefore, it will only take place after the entire Tchuf of the Mashiach ben Yosef will have been matured and developed, and to a large degree finished. That's when it will happen. Now you may say, what fundamentally is the Ruchnistik of this Milchama? Well, before I speak about the Ruchnis, what will happen in this Milchama? We once discussed a long time ago that this will be the very first battle. How will this battle take place? Will it be physical? Will it be ruchnius? It's difficult to say. Most likely this will not be a physical battle, in the real sense of the word. But it'll be a battle which will take place b'koyach hanes, or b'koyach of things which have to do with l'mayla medech hateva in some way. It's not clear how this battle will take place. So the question here is, the process of the Milchemes Gog and Magog. As I say, it's difficult to understand how exactly the Milchama will take place. But what happens in Gog and Magog is an interesting thing. And before we go into the actual Milchama itself and the involvement of the Mashiach ben Yosef and of a new figure who will arise to deal with this, I just want to first go back and say, what is the entire ruchnius of Gog and Magog? What's happening? Why suddenly, after the Mashiach appears, right? Mashiach appears and all the Yidden back in Israel. Why suddenly is there a Milchama called Gog and Magog? Fundamentally, Gog and Magog is really the physical manifestation of a really ruchnistic event. And what that is that it's something that has to be understood. There is a very strong possibility that, as I have mentioned before, that the final Geula will not be totally Mitoch HaChesed. Not totally Mitoch HaChesed. But there will be a certain amount of Achishena into that Geula. Because of that, because of the fact that there is a certain inyan of an Achishena, there is therefore a certain aspect of Kitrug in that kind of sense. Or, what will happen in the end is that when the Mashiach ben Yosef already appeared, what happens? He's already brought out the Torah, a large extent of the Torah out from the Klippa, and it's been revealed, he's in Magala, the Torah B'tzusach HaKeser, which is the Orish Mashiach, which means that the Satan himself, Sam, realizes that he's losing a vast amount of his power, and he instinctively is aware that he's about to lose it all forever. In doing so, what he does is he attempts to muster up the last koyach and the last accusation, kitrug, against Klal Yisrael to recapture again his koyach shlit over them. This process happened again in the Gula Rishonah, and it happened by where? By Yetzias Mitzrayim. When? That once the Yidden went out of Mitzrayim, there was another din Torah that was established by Yam Suf. You see, that there was a Sunim Badin. After the Mitzrayim, they let the Yidden went out of Mitzrayim, the Mitzrayim ran after them, and so on, because again, suddenly the Satan realized, wait a minute, what happened here? The Goyim, the Kedusha, is out of the Tumah, and there was a certain part of it that now became impoverished. So there was again a reintroduction of the Kitrug in the Beis Shemalot, where the Satan ran up and says, wait a minute, what's going on over here? They shouldn't be Zercha to a Gula Shlema, to a Gula. So there was a new reevaluation, and the Beis Shemalot sat down to paskin the din again. Is Klal Yisrael Zercha to a Geula, you see. And there was a tremendous shakla v'tari up in the Shemayim while the Yidden were at the Yam Suf, they're waiting. Until finally the psak was that the Yidden are Zercha, and instantly it was needed that all the Mitzrayim would die, in that sense. So at the end of Kriyas Yam Suf, all the Yidden were free. This is the thing. That's the meaning of that last din Torah. They are gone forever. The Klippa is gone. It's not only the fact that the Kedusha is out of the Klippa, that there's a cheres there, but that the klipa is gone forever. It is this very same attempt what the Sultan did a long time ago by Yetzias Mitzrayim, namely by Kriyas Yamsuf, that the Sultan again will attempt this here. You see. And remember, that last attempt was done what? After the Jews went out, and after Moshe Rabbeinu was clearly the established money. Then there was a re-kitrug. It's the same thing over here. After the Mashiach ben Yosef takes all the Yidden out of the Golus, there's a kibbutz Golus already. Just like at that time there was already a Yetzias Mitzrayim. And after the fact that they're in Eretz Yisrael, there will be a new kitrug that will come up to attempt to re-establish, to control the shlita of the Sultan on the Bria again. That is the Mechomas Gog and Magog. That is the physical counterpart of that particular Mechama. Now, it's difficult to say. If the Gula took place purely by Chesed, purely without any Achishena whatsoever, would there be a Mechomas Gog and Magog? That's very difficult to say. You see. You know, once the Gula, once the Golus went down to the Kate itself, down to the end, you see, could there be a Kitrug? Probably not. You see. Because the entire thing would have been Masukkan. So there cannot really be a Kitrug anymore. There's nothing much to be Makatrig in that kind of sense. It's possible, although I'm not clear, that maybe the Gog and Magog would not have transpired if the Kate itself was reached. It is possible that Gog and Magog is an event which takes place when there's still a slight Achishena left. And Adrabah, since the fact that the Nevi'im, namely Yechezkel, were Misnabe, prophesied in meaning Gog and Magog, it is possible that the Nevuah of Gog and Magog is a Nevuah that says that even though Yeshaya was Nisnabe, that what? That the Mashiach would be Oni Rochav al-Achamor, Zechariah, that it would be Oni Rochav al-Achamor, and then Mashiach would be in a certain state of Kilkul, which means that Klal Yisrael would go all the way down to the Kate Achron, right? Before there would be any Gula, because that's what the Mashiach looks like, that's obviously what they will look like, right? Yechezkel comes along with another Nevi'us that says, yes, Alpha became, you see, there will be a certain amount of Achishena. You see. Why? Because there's going to be a Gog and Magog. It appears there is a possibility that one Nevi'us was there to offset the other. That the Nevi'us of Yeshaya was Nisnabe. You see. That the Moshe Mashiach will take place Be'ita and not the Achishena. Because of the matzah of the Mashiach as he appears. And Yechezkel comes along and says that in Chanami, however, even though this is true, it will take place in such a way where there will still be a certain amount of Kitrug available, a certain amount of Achishena, and that's why there will be a Mechomas Gog and Magog. But in any case, whether that's correct or not, there's no question that the Mechomas Gog and Magog is coming from a Kitrug. It's coming from the last attempt of the Sultan to re-establish himself. So this is fundamentally the Yeruchnistika process which underlies the physical process of the war itself. Now, let's get on to the next thing. We said a while back about the whole scenario of the Mashiach ben Yosef dying, right? And what we said is fundamentally is that Gog and Magog is Amalek, Esav, and the Erevav attempting to undo the Mashiach ben Yosef. Now, if the Gzeirah of the Mashiach ben Yosef was such, since you love him, that he would have to die, it means that this is the koyach of Gog and Magog. Gog and Magog have the koyach to attempt to unseat the Mashiach ben Yosef. Why? Because of the chet of Yerovam ben Nevat. In other words, because of the chet of Yerovam ben Nevat and of Klal Yisrael, of the Asor Shvatim themselves. You see, and this is critical to understand that Yerovam ben Nevat with their golem, because of the calves that were worshipped, and the Asor Shvatim, what they did was they were poigam in the union of Mashiach ben Yosef itself, which is the biggest pagam at all. That means that the kedusha or the awe, which is actually connected in a certain sense with the Mashiach ben Yosef, very high up. That kedusha itself, the highest form of kedusha, went all the way down to the klipa. That means that the Sultan has a piece of Mashiach ben Yosef. His neshama, but he's got a piece of it not because of Soiv l'chaloyim, not because the Mashiach has to be Soiv l'tzot or Chayzel. He's got a piece of it mitzvah din, because of the fact that a piece of that Mashiach ben Yosef was over a chait. That's a terrible kilkel. It is that piece which is held onto for thousands of years. That is the piece which is in Gog and Magog, you see. And according to the scenario where the Gemara says that the Mashiach ben Yosef should die at the end, where Gog and Magog is matzliach to kill the Mashiach ben Yosef. That's what the Gemara says. That the Gzeres Mashiach Yosef should die. Why? Because of the peace that he has. The son that has the peace, he has a peace of the Kedushas Mashiach ben Yosef himself, from the Inyan itself, from the Mashiachos itself, he has a slight peace that was given to him from the Chet of Yerovim and the Asos HaShvotim. And it's that peace that he's holding in his bosom and saying, aha, this is the peace that I hold on to me and that I will attempt to destroy Klal Yisrael at the end. This is my guarantee, you see. And he doesn't use that peace until the Mechamas Gog and Magog. You see. At the time of Gog and Magog, when the Mashiach ben Yosef suddenly becomes strong and so on, he comes up with this last this last nitzis to the Bnei Shalom, and he says, I have it. I have the Inyan Mashiach ben Yosef in my hands, you see. And it's in the hands of Gog and Magog because they represent me. And that's the din. According to the scenario of the Gemara, according to what the Gemara says, that is enough to turn the din against Klal Yisrael. So because of that, the Mashiach ben Yosef and the Kufa of the Mashiach ben Yosef must be given into the hands of the Goyim. And by doing that, that all then again returns to Klal Yisrael, you see. But it means that the Mashiach ben Yosef himself, when he is a Mashiach ben Yosef, you see, has to be given to the Klippa, to the Satan, because of the din. You see what I'm saying? That's why the Gog and Magog can only take place after the Mashiach, not before. Because Gog and Magog had no interest in undoing Klal Yisrael before the Mashiach appeared. Gog and Magog is a taina against the Mashiach ben Yosef himself, you see. But that taina cannot appear until the Mashiach ben Yosef appears and the Tkufa's here. That's the fundamental point. That's why Gog and Magog takes place after the Mashiach ben Yosef. It's the last attempt to undo the whole Tkufa of the Mashiach ben Yosef, whose function is to matar the Bria and remove the Zoyama. It's the last attempt of the Zoyama, of the Nochash, to recapture the Uris. And it does that with the last piece of din that it has. Use it Klal Yisrael Zercha to the Gula, Lo Zan Azai. You say Klal Yisrael Zercha Mashiach ben Yosef, Lo Zan Azai. But you say that the Mashiach ben Yosef should be Matzliach and totally removing the Zoyama? Not so. It cannot be. Because I hold that all of the Mashiach ben Yosef in my hand from the Chet of Yerom ben Avot and the Asos HaShvotim. They were pogrom mitzad din, the Inyan Mashiach ben Yosef itself. With that, I have the right to undermine the very process after it already is formulated. So mitzad din would say you're right. So normally, what the Gemara says, that the Mashiach ben Yosef therefore would have died, and Klal Yisrael would have lost the battle, which means that the whole Kibbutz Goliath and all these things would have been undermined. That's exactly what it is. And if you notice, the one who killed the Mashiach ben Yosef is the Erevav, is Amulus. Mashiach ben Yosef dies at the hands of Amulus HaRasha. Amulus HaRasha is the head of the Erevav. Why does the Mashiach ben Yosef die at the hands of the Erevav? Why? What? Because the fundamental, it's a thing, but why the Erevav? Why not Esav? Because the fundamental thing is, because since the time of the Chet of the Egel, the Inyan Mashiach ben Yosef was then always related to the Klip of the Erevav in that kind of sense. Yes, in that kind of sense. And the Inyan of what's the name of Yerovim, if you notice, what did Yerovim do? Yerovim took a golem, an Egel, and he had Klal to worship an Egel. What's the Inyan of an Egel? The Inyan of Mashiach ben Yosef. It's the same thing as by the Chet of the Egel itself. It's always an Egel. What's the Inyan of an Egel? Because I think I was master the first time that the Mashiach ben Yosef before the Chet of Egel was involved with the Chet of Adam Rishon. See, that was different. That was more. But after the Chet of the Egel, the Mashiach ben Yosef is now involved with the Egel itself, with the Erevav. You see, and if you had golems, the Erevav will now hold the last of the thing. So therefore, the Satan will be able to, through Amulus, through the Erevav himself, he will be able to kill the Mashiach ben Yosef. Fortunately, however, that scenario will not take place. That will not take place for a number of reasons. Mostly because of the Yisud of Moshe Rabbeinu in the clip of the Erevav itself. Since the Bnei Shem said to him, Lech reid kishiches as amachot, go down to Mashiachas, because it's your nation, the Erevav, who you brought into Klal Yisrael, which has destroyed the possibility of the first Gula. So therefore, Lech reid, you must go down into their klippa. And that's why Moshe Rabbeinu never went into Eretz Yisrael. Moshe died in Chutz La'aretz, and the Neshama went into the Sefer Chalayim of the Chet of the Erevav itself. And because he's assuming that he's Sefer from the Erevav, and because of the tremendous golus of Eretz Klal Yisrael in the golus itself, the 2,000 years of such an arichas, Klal Yisrael has been able to be masaken and has taken back from that itself. They have taken back that itself the Inyan of the Mashiach ben Yosef, so that when it finally does appear, according to the Vilna Gaon, the Ramchal, a lot of people say this, that fundamentally the Gzera of the Mashiach ben Yosef has been lifted, so when the Mashiach ben Yosef does appear and he accomplishes what he does, it will be effectuated, it will be performed, and it will be finished. And what happens is that the Mashiach ben Yosef will arise and will kill and destroy Amr Salasha, the Erev, Amalek, and Esav for the last time. This is very important. After Gog and Magog, there is no more Esav. There is no more Erev. This is their last stand. Custer's last stand. It is the last stand of the Erev and Amalek. After Mechomas Gog and Magog, there is no more Klippa whatsoever. Like Moshe Rabbeinu said about Mitzrayim, as you see them today, you will never see them again. Klal Yisrael, after Gog and Magog, will never see another Klippa. Never again. There is one thing also which is very important. That there, at that point in time, right by Gog and Magog, a new individual will appear. Suddenly. Quickly, swiftly, and suddenly. A new individual will appear beside the Mashiach ben Yosef. And who can that be? Mashiach ben David. Right, the Mashiach ben David does not actually appear until that time. Before then, no one really will know who he is or what he is and so on. But in the time of Gog and Magog, he will appear. Under the scenario that the Mashiach ben Yosef would have died, had that been Mekuyim, what would have happened is the Mashiach ben David would have had to go and destroy Gog and Magog, and by destroying Gog and Magog, be Mechayah Meth the Mashiach ben Yosef, and then continue it. You see, that was the original scenario. If the Mashiach ben Yosef had died, because obviously if he had died in the hands of Amalek and Amalek, right, what would have happened? I mean, one of the Trei Mashiachim died. Then the other Mashiach, the Mashiach ben David, would have had to go to complete the mission and destroy Gog and Magog and resurrect Mashiach ben Yosef from death itself. And both of them would have gone on into the Mashiach. But since that will not happen, it is the Mashiach ben Yosef and the Ikar who will destroy Gog and Magog, because this represents the Koyach of Esav and the Erevav to matar the Zoyim of the Bria, which is the essence of what? Of Yosef. But in this war, Mashiach ben David will also take place. And both of them will destroy Mashiach ben David. And this is what the Pasuk says this often. V'olu Moshiach b'hat Tzion lishpoites ha'esav. Moshiach to the Mashiach ben Yosef and the Mashiach ben David. V'olu Moshiach, and both Moshiach, the Trei Mashiachim, will arise b'hat Tzion lishpoites ha'esav, to destroy Gog and Magog, Esav, Amalek, and Erevav for the last time. So the final war will be done by the Mashiach ben Yosef and the Mashiach ben David. And at that point in time, that period fundamentally constitutes the beginning of the closure of the Tkufa of the Mashiach ben Yosef. Now the question that has been asked, the question is, what about the Mashiach ben David? He suddenly makes his appearance at the Muhammad's Gog and Magog, but the interesting question is, where did he come from? And what fundamentally is his history? It's a difficult question to go into, but my understanding is as follows, that basically, at the time that the Mashiach ben Yosef goes out of his Klippa, goes out of the Klippa, obviously, if he goes out of the Klippa, obviously that must affect the individual who's the Mashiach ben David as well. And that's really what happened. The Mashiach ben David will also go out of the Klippa. The Mashiach ben David is in a Klippa too. But the question is, what kind of Klippa is it? But in any case, the Mashiach ben David is also in a Klippa. At the release of the Mashiach ben Yosef from his Klippa, this will also happen to Mashiach ben David. You see. But except that Mashiach ben David, even though he's no longer in his Klippa, will simply not be known by Klal Yisrael. Who he is and what he is as an individual will not be known, basically. And he will only appear at this point. Prior to this point, his presence is not really necessary, because he's not involved functionary-wise in this process in any direct way. He will probably have some kind of indirect functioning, although I would suspect it's extremely minimal, for reasons which I do not want to go into here. Very minimal, if anything at all. And essentially he will be more like a passive spectator to the situation as it goes on. And the essential tkufa will be that of Mashiach ben Yosef. He will appear at the time that he should appear, which is right before his actual beginning, which is only starts by Milchemes Gog and Magog. And he will appear there probably towards the end or in the middle of Milchemes Gog and Magog, together with the Mashiach ben Yosef. But I do not believe that Klal Yisrael will know of him at all. The only one who will know who he is, where he is the Mashiach ben Yosef himself. And there is much more to the story, but this is all that we will talk about on this tape. I'd like to now speak about the Mashiach ben David, the Tkufat Mashiach ben David. The conflict of the Milchemes Gog and Magog, which is connected to Mashiach ben Yosef, is the last conflict which will be experienced by Klal Yisrael and the world. It's an incredible thing. It is the last great war. It is the last great conflict. After this, there is no more conflict. It then ushers in the Moshe Mashiach itself. Now, as we said, Milchemes Gog and Magog will be handled by both Mashiach ben Yosef and the Mashiach ben David, by both. And then, as the Milchemes Gog and Magog ends, and Esav is destroyed fundamentally, Amalek is destroyed, from that point on, the next step is the coronation of the Mashiach ben David. The Mashiach ben David, then his kufa starts. From that point on starts the kufa of the Mashiach ben David, and that of course starts with the coronation, where he is anointed king as such. And that starts what's known as Malchus Beis David. This period starts what we call the Yemot HaMashiach, the true Yemot HaMashiach, because it's a time when the tikkun of the world is now taken over by David. Now, remember, we must always look at things from the pneumius. And the pneumius of the Indian is not just that one Mashiach dropped out of sight and the other Mashiach suddenly came to sight, that he took over here in that kind of sense. It's not what that at all. What had happened is fundamentally is a change, a shift in process, in function. It means that fundamentally the Tkuf of the Mashiach ben Yosef was involved in being Mataya, the Bria from the Zohar. And since it was a climactic period, he was the climactic Mashiach ben Yosef. It means that this period involves the last removal of the Zohar in terms of the way we know it, in terms of the Tumah and the Chatoim of Klal Yisrael in the Bria, in that way. Ephraim Ma'oz Roshi, the Tkufa of Mashiach ben Yosef, which is symbolized by the pasuk Ephraim Ma'oz Roshi, the defense of my head. In other words, of taking the Torah out of the Klippa, the Gilui of the Pnimis HaTorah, of the Nun Sharabino, of the Gilui of the Torah B'tzurus HaKeser, which is the Torah, the Orish HaMashiach. This takes place in the Tkufa of Mashiach ben Yosef. When the Mashiach ben David is crowned, it means that we go on to the next step of the tikkun, which is the tikkun of the Mashiach ben David, and that's to begin to elevate the Bria from a state of chesuron to a state of shlemus. And that's the process of zichuch, of kedusha. No longer, this is a very critical thing, no longer will the Bria be involved with dealing with refuas, choili, and machlas in that kind of sense, and refuas ha-nefesh in that way. No longer will the Bria be dealing with yisurin and kapora. These concepts will no more be critical. It's an amazing thing. I mean, for thousands of years, since the time of Adam Rishon, the central themes have always been kapora, yisurin, and golus, and so on. These have been always the central themes, and tshuva in that kind of sense. With the inception of the Tkuf of the Mashiach ben David, this period will end. The Bria will no longer be concerned with these themes. What will then the Bria be concerned with? This is a staggering zach. The Bria will be concerned with Kedusha, with Aliyah, with Ruchnius upon Ruchnius upon Ruchnius, with greater and greater Chochmas, in terms of understanding the Pnimius of the Bria, in terms of the Pnimius of the Hashgacha Pratis itself. It's a time, it's a circumstance which is involved with pure Ruchnius itself, not with the removal of Tumah, or the removal of Zohar, or the removal of Choli in that sense. It's a growth period It's not a cleansing period. That's the Tkuf of the Mashiach ben David. And this is what he ushers in. And that's what it says in the Pasuk, Yehuda mechoyteki. The Tkuf of the Mashiach ben David, the process which fundamentally signifies, is done, is instrumentalized, is symbolized by the Mashiach ben David, will take over this concept of Zichoch, of being Mekadosh the Bria itself. And how is that done? Through the Malchus of the Mashiach ben David. The Mashiach ben David is the individual who is the Melech of all Klal Yisrael. Not only of Klal Yisrael, the Mashiach ben David is the Melech al Kol HaOlam. The Mashiach ben David will reign from one end of the earth to the other. Why? Because as we said, why is that? Because the world will have achieved a certain level of Giloi. It will achieve such a staggering level of Giloi that the Hakov, the Bonishal, is known from one end of the world to the other. So therefore, to parallel this Hasogas Yechudoi of Yehoyah Hashem Lemelech HaKol HaOd, Vayomu Hashem Echad Yishmo Echad, to parallel this Midas HaYichud which will exist at that time, it corresponds to the political instrumentation on the world where one king will rule the entire world. The Mashiach ben David will be the Melech of the entire world. There will no longer be Melechim of the Goyim in that sense. Perhaps there will be governors, provincial governors in that sense, or territorial, administrators as such. But the only king of that time will be the Mashiach ben David himself. That Malchus will reign, and therefore the Gil of the Bonishon, the Gil of his Malchus, becomes manifest in the Gil of the Malchus of the Mashiach ben David itself. That's why the Mashiach ben David cannot come till the Mashiach ben Yosef does his job. Because we cannot come to the Malchus of the Bonishon, to be Makkah his Malchus, until first Makkah, until first remove the Hester which exists in the Bria, the Hester on the Hester Yechudoi, the Hester of Einoid Mavadoi. When the Bria is Zercha to the Madreg of Einoid Mavadoi, then there's Zercha to one Melech, both in the Shemayim and on earth. And the Mashiach ben David represents that. You see, that's the essence. The essence of Mashiach ben David is Malchus, and the essence of Malchus is rulership, is absolute shlito, absolute control. You see, because the Mashiach ben David is the parallel to the Bnei Shalom at that point, to the Midas HaYichud at that point, which is the Malchus of the Bnei Shalom. Why does the Mashiach ben David rule through Malchus? Fundamentally, because that's the only time that Malchus will be able to be established. Malchus would never be able to be established in Klal Yisrael really through Malchus or in the world before the time of the Mashiach ben David. Why is it that the Mashiach ben David is involved with Malchus to begin with? We understand why Malchus can only appear at that time. But why is the Mashiach ben David involved in Malchus? Basically, because his process involves Zichoch. It involves promoting Yerushalayim, promoting Kedusha, promoting the Or HaTorah, the Or HaMashiach, in a way where he has absolute control over that in the entire Bria. You see, just like a Melech is in control of his kingdom in terms of administrative control, fiscal policy, governmental policy, and so on and so forth, the Malchus of the Mashiach ben David is not fundamentally a political Malchus, you see, although it will be subsumed in that way. The Malchus of the Mashiach ben David is a Malchus of Buchnius. That's the emissary of Malchus. It's a Malchus of Buchnius, of an Or, of Or HaTorah. Memela, from the Malchus of Buchnius, there will be a Malchus of political activity as well. Because all political activity is subservient to the Malchus of Buchnius. If you are in control of the entire Buchnius of the Bria, if the whole Oruch Mashiach of the Buchnius of the Bria goes through this Melech called the Mashiach ben David, Memela, all the Hashkoch of the Bria goes to him. All political activity, all economic activity, everything goes to the Mashiach ben David. You see, through this Malchus. So therefore the Malchus of the Mashiach ben David, which is a Malchus of Buchnius, becomes the conduit, or the vehicle, in which the Malchus, the Olam Hazeh Malchus, you see, in terms of all its ways, the Tevatik Malchus, Olam Hazeh in terms of governmental control, and the general Hashkocha, fiscal control, and so on and so forth, automatically go through this Malchus. This is the Inyan Zach. The absolute Shlita of Buchnius will be in the hands of one man, who's the Mashiach ben David, and therefore every aspect of the Bria is in the hands of that one man. And that's the Inyan of what? Of Malchus. That's why what we also said is that Mashiach ben David must come from David HaMelech, and fundamentally it's a one-to lineage, because Malchus is something which is passed down from Dor Achador through a lineage.
Mashiach ben Yosef basically phased out, or?
The question is, if this is true, and now the Mashiach, the Tkuf, the Mashiach ben David now arises, and he is the fundamental soul representative of the Orish Mashiach in that way, in the sense that he is the main processor of the process called the Tikkun of the Chasson of the Bria. What happened to the Mashiach ben Yosef? Basically, what happens to Mashiach ben Yosef is that Mashiach ben Yosef, what I believe happens is that the Mashiach ben Yosef really, his Tekufa subsides, but not as Koyach. In other words, the Orish Mashiach, the Or HaYichud, this Or HaGonos, which is nispashed to the entire world, this Ruchnius, still comes fundamentally through both Trei Mashiachim and to Moshe Rabbeinu in that sense. It comes to the Trei Mashiachim. But basically the control or the responsibility of the Tikkun lies basically with the Mashiach ben David. It's not so much a question of the shorish of that Ruchnius. I believe it's more of a question of the responsibility of that Tikkun. The Tkuf of the Mashiach ben David means that the responsibility of the Tikkun of the Chasson of the Bria, because in Moshe Mashiach will be similar to the Matzav of Adam Rishon Kodesh Machet. The responsibility for that Tikkun to take the world from a level of Chasson to a level of Shlemus lies with the individual, the person called the Mashiach ben David. But the shorish of the Ruchnius itself, which comes down to the world, I believe still goes through the Trei Mashiachim, so that the Mashiach ben Yosef, in that sense, becomes an associate of the Mashiach ben David in terms of, or actually an equal of the Mashiach ben David in terms of the dispensation or the vehicle for Ruchnius. But in terms of the actual responsibility of it, that's carried over to the Mashiach ben David. Just like previously in his Kuf the Mashiach ben Yosef, the Ruchnius and the responsibility were both seen in Mashiach ben Yosef. Later on, by the Mechamas Gog and Magog, when the Mashiach ben David appears, he's still only an associate in that sense of the Mashiach ben David. Both of them vanquish Gog and Magog. They destroy Gog and Magog in that sense. But the actual responsibility of this entire effort lies with the Mashiach ben Yosef. But the Mashiach ben David also is a shurish to the koyach which is used to vanquish Gog and Magog. And in the truth of the Mashiach ben David, that's reversed. The Mashiach ben David becomes the essential individual who has the responsibility of the Tikkun, but the shurish of the Ruchnius, which is needed for that Tikkun, comes to the Trei Mashiachim. And let's not forget, it comes to another individual, Moshe Rabbeinu. Why? The interesting question is this, on Moshe Rabbeinu. Why is Moshe Rabbeinu considered so important in the Gula Sida? Look, Moshe Rabbeinu was a shurish of Mashiach ben Yosef, but his generation failed, didn't it? Fundamentally, his generation failed. And because of the failure with the Chet Degel, Leich Reid, the Bonishim said, Leich Reid from your Mashiachos. He was no longer the Mashiach ben Yosef in that sense. There were many Mashiach ben Yosef that didn't make it, right? Rabbi Kiva didn't make it either, and so on. We don't find such a prominent place of Rabbi Kiva in the Gula Asida. We don't find it. I mean, his appearance will be there. We don't find only Moshe Rabbeinu. That fundamentally, what even Ramchal says, Gimel Yukumo b'Yisrael. Moshe u the Trei Mashiachim. The Trei Mashiachim and Moshe who is Mechaber the Trei Mashiachim. The question is why? What's the significance of Moshe Rabbeinu above and beyond all the other Mashiachim and Yosef who were not successful in bringing the Gula? That's basically the question here. Why does he play such a central role beside the Trei Mashiachim? Moshe Rabbeinu, in truth matters, Moshe Rabbeinu was different than all other Mashiachim. Why? Because what Moshe Rabbeinu did succeed in doing is something that no one had ever succeeded before. What Moshe Rabbeinu did was not the fact that he brought Klal Yisrael out of Mitzrayim. That's an important thing. But that's not what makes a Mashiach. What is the essence that makes a Mashiach? What is the essential function of the Mashiach ben Yosef? Exactly. The essential thing of the Mashiach ben Yosef, and I can't overestimate this too much. If you do not understand this, then the truth is you do not understand what the Mashiach ben Yosef. When it says Ephraim Mo'oz Roshi, Mo'oz Roshi, my head. What's the head of the Bnei Shalom? Torah. The Hasogas Yechudoi. That's the Rosh. The Midas HaYichud, which is shown at that time. The essence of the Mashiach ben Yosef is to be Megala Yehuda Ba'olam. How? By being Megala, the Ora Torah, which is shy to the world at that time. But in order to do that, he has to lift up the Torah from its klipa, from its mokum of Hester. That in truth is synonymous with the Gil of the Shechin as well. Since the time of Adam, the Chet of Adam Rishon, in order to save the world, the Shekhinah went into Golos. Where do we know that the Shekhinah goes into the klipa? We take a learn out this parsha in the Tzavim. It says V'shova Hashem lekacho eshvuscho v'michamecho. So Rashi says there, right? He says there. It says V'shov lekacho. So you see that what do you call it? That the Bonishum is matzil two things. He's pointed two things. Not only shvuscho but eselkacho, which means that the Shekhinah also goes in the Golos. The Parsha in Sovim. Mama says that over there. You see, when the Shekhinah goes in the Golos, what does it mean when it goes in the Klippa? It means, what is the Shekhinah? It means that the ore that it's capable of being Ashpia, which is the ore of Olam Haba. It's the ore Torah. It's the ore of what? Of the Das Torah, of the ore Pnimi. The Pnimi is the Torah. That's what goes into the Klippa. You see. So when the Mashiach ben Yosef, what his basic job is, when we say he's the Matar the Bria, it means to Matar Tumah from all the Shamas. But fundamentally, what it really means is that it's to Matar two basic things. The Shekhinah and the Yechida. These are the two things. Why? Because these are the two instruments of the Orish Mashiach. The Shekhinah is that aspect of the Bonisham which is Mashpia, the Or HaTorah, the Or Chochmah, the Or HaSoga on the Gili Yehuda on Klal Yisrael, and Yechida is the Neshama which serves as the conduit in which that all will pass through the Mashiach and to every Neshama in Klal Yisrael. Those are the two items. Remember this. It's the Shekhinah which is the Mashpia of the Or Torah, and it's the Yechida which is the Makabel of the Or Torah. All people in Klal Yisrael in the time of Moshe Mashiach and in the Mabba are ne'atar. They are crowned with what? With this crown. This crown is the Yechida. It's a neshama, which when it enters into the person or connects with the person, suddenly gives him a level of what? Of awareness, of consciousness. It's a new level of awareness. It's a level of awareness which is capable of being masig, the yichud, which is projected by the Shekhinah. You see, if we understand what a neshama is, the way we've explained it, the neshama fundamentally affects the state of awareness of the being, the conscious being. You see, nobody can ever be masig the Orish Mashiach or the Or of Olam Haba without Yechida. That is the neshama which all Yidden will require in which to be masig that Or else it's not Shaykh. Why? Because the Yechida, what is Yechida? It is a neshama that exists on a certain existential plane. But the existential plane that Yechida is part of is the world, the highest of all the worlds, which is called Adam Kadmon, and it's the first world that the Baruch made as a Nivra. So therefore it's the closest to him. You see, it therefore has the existential capacity to connect or to experience the Urus on that plane, which is the highest level of Hasakas Yichudoi. That neshama becomes connected to every neshama of Klal Yisrael. So therefore suddenly every neshama of every person in Klal Yisrael becomes infused with the ability to become aware or sensitized to whatever's going on that plane. You see, and that's the Orish Mashiach, and that's the Or Olam Haba in that sense. You see, and where does that all come from? From the Shekhinah. So, what the Mashiach ben Yosef does, and this is the central definition of Mashiach ben Yosef. You see, that's why when you say that Moshe Rabbeinu is Mashiach ben Yosef, and people don't understand it, nobody understands the core of what Mashiach ben Yosef is, and why Moshe Rabbeinu was the Mashiach ben Yosef par excellence. You see. Why? And the same thing with Avraham and so on. Because the Mashiach ben Yosef is metar in that sense. The Yechida, or is matzah, is poida, is removes the Yechida and in a sense the Shekhinah from the Klippa which is entombed in. And by doing that, suddenly the Or which is Shaykh to both, the Or which is Mashpiyah the Shekhinah and the Or which is Makabel Yechida, suddenly is now Shaykh to all of Yidden. That is the Mashiach ben Yosef. But mainly in order to do that, he's also goyal every neshama from its power as well. You see, that's the essence of Gula. What is the essence of Golos? And I cannot repeat this over and over again enough times. The essence of Golos is what? Is when something belongs in one state and it goes to a foreign state, an alien state. Neshamas belong with Ruchnius. It belongs to Torah. When a neshama has no shaykhs to Or the Or HaTorah which is appropriate for it, it's said to be in Golos. When the neshamas are placed in klippas, when the Yechida goes in the klippa, when the Shekhinah goes to the Klippa, this constitutes the essence of Golos. It goes to a mokum where it no longer can benefit, you see, or support itself from the Or which is Shaykh to it. In the case of Shekhinah, it cannot give out the Or which is Shaykh to it. That's its difficulty. The function of Mashiach ben Yosef is to bring a Geula, That's why we said that the Tkuf of the Mashiach ben Yosef is the meaning of Gula. When it says that the Bias Goyal Tzedek should come, it's only talking about the Mashiach ben Yosef. Because it's the Mashiach ben Yosef who's a Goyal in that sense. Technically speaking, the Mashiach ben David is not a Goyal. Why? Because the Mashiach ben David is not concerned with Golas. You see, he's concerned with Chasaron. But Chasaron is not Golas. It's a different matzav. The matzav of Adam Rishon before the Chet is not a matzav of Golas. It's a matzav of Chasaron, of inadequacy. You see, that's the essence of Mashiach ben Yosef. Is to take out that all from the clip itself. Now, why was Moshe Rabbeinu a Mashiach ben Yosef? Why was he different than all of the Mashiach ben Yosef? Because the truth of the matter is, he succeeded in doing that. Because he brought down the Luchas Rishonis. The Luchas Rishonis, the first Luchas that he was given is what? Those were the Orishim Mashiach. Those are the Luchas that Klal Yisrael should have taken, and with that, should have gone to Israel to start the Moshe Mashiach. That was the Torah B'Tzuz HaKeser, the Luchas Rishonis. So therefore, what Moshe did succeed in doing is to take those Luchas from the Bnei Shalom. He took it. He took it from its Mokum, you see, and he took it down, and he said, I have it now. I have it, and Klal Yisrael has it now. He succeeded in making that transfer. But he did not succeed in giving it to Klal Yisrael. So therefore, Moshe was a half Mashiach. You see, he succeeded in taking it from the Bnei Shalom. But then when Klal Yisrael was not Zecha, he took it and he broke it and he threw it in the ground. So Klal Yisrael never took it. There was a Nesina, but there was never Kabbalah. You see. But the very fact that there was a Nesina, you see, the fact that the Bnei Shalom gave it to Moshe and that he took it to Bnei Shalom means that he entered into a level of Madrega which no other Mashiach ben Yosef ever went in before. He was a full-fledged Mashiach in that sense.
But there wasn't.
But, one more thing. Where do you see this? It says, Torah Tziva Lanu Moshe, Moirosha Kilas Yaakov, right? So I think there's a Chazal that says, Al Tikvi Moirosha Ela Mo'oirosha. What Moshe Rabbeinu succeeded in doing, he made Klal Yisrael into an Arusa, an Erisin. That's where Mo'oirosha. Klal Yisrael before the Matan Torah was a Kala, and the Bnei Shalom Kaviyachol was a Chosim. And the Bnei Shalom wanted to be Mizavik with Klal Yisrael, Kaviyachol in that sense. Right? So Klal Yisrael came to Mount Sinai. No, the Kala standing, right? No, let's do the Erisin. So Moshe Rabbeinu said, okay, the Erisin. He took the Luchas Rishonis. You see, so as soon as he took the Luchas Rishonis, Klal Yisrael was an Arusa. How do we know it was an Arusa? Because if they weren't an Arusa, how was the Shaykh a Chet to the Egel? The Chet to the Egel was an Avodah Zohar. But the only way it's an Avodah Zohar. But the truth of the matter is, the Chet to the Egel as an Avodah Zohar can only be shaykh if there was a mitzvah connected Avodah Zohar. You see, a new tzivoy. But that only came after the Luchas Rishonos were given. That's why, in a certain way, Klal Yisrael was nimshal to a soita. It's the same thing. But a woman is not a soita unless she's married. At least she's an arusa. You see, naira marasa. You see what I'm saying? She has to be spin arusa. If she's not arusa, there's no Indian soita. There's no adultery here at all. She's not an Eishes Ish. Moshe Rabbeinu succeeded in making Klal Yisrael into an Eishes Ish, but only an arusa. He did not succeed in giving Klal Yisrael the kala, the luchas. If he succeeded, she would have become a nesua. So Klal Yisrael was never zecher to a chuppah. That's why it says, Oy Yishama v'O Yehuda, Kol Chosim v'Kol Kala. What is that pasuk talking about? Kol Chosim v'Kol Simcha, Kol Chosim v'Kol Kala. Oh, Yishama doing again will be heard again the original enterprise of the chasana that took place around Sinai. But this time there will be a nesuin, you see, because a latter day Mashiach ben Yosef will succeed in making Klal Yisrael into a nesua. You see, whereas Moshe succeeded in making them into an arusa. So what do we see from this? We see therefore that Moshe was a Mashiach ben Yosef. You see. And so on. He is no less a Mashiach ben Yosef than the next one, the last Mashiach ben Yosef is. Because each one will only do one half the job. You see. What's the miyuchas of the last Mashiach ben Yosef? Why? Because he's zocher to the Pnimi? Why? But he's only zocher to the Nesuim. He didn't make Klal Yisrael to the Arusa. You see? So therefore we see that you can be a Mashiach ben Yosef with only half the job, half the Kedushin. You see. But the one who was Mekadosh Klal Yisrael with an Arusa was Moshe Rabbeinu. So in that sense, Moshe was as true a Mashiach ben Yosef, functionally, process-wise, in terms of Tachlis Mashiach ben Yosef, as the last Mashiach ben Yosef will be. There's no nafkamina. That's why in the end, the Geula Asida will come out of the Trei Mashiachim, and Moshe Rabbeinu also. Because Moshe started the Inyan, he will also be involved with the last Mashiach ben Yosef in the Nesuin of Klal Yisrael itself. Or Yishama Ba'o Yehuda Kol Chosim V'Kol Kala. And this is the Zach, and that's why Moshe is involved with the last Gula itself. The function of the Mashiach Ben Yosef, like I say, what Moshe should have accomplished, he should have made Klal Yisrael to Narusa, and he should have made them the Mesua. In other words, what a Mashiach Ben Yosef does is take the Oagonas from the Baruch Shalom, or the Panimi, and completely give it to Klal Yisrael so it lifts them up. In other words, he's zoicha to a complete Gula of the Or Torah. But Moshe Rabbeinu was only zoicha to half the Gula of the Or Torah. That's why he was never zoicha to the Nun Shar Rabbeinu, you see. That's why. Why? Because he succeeded in being zoicha to the Memta Shar Rabbeinu. He took out the Torah Gonos, he took out these luchos and so on, and he was zoicha, but he himself was not zoicha to the last Or. Because Chayso cannot be zoicha to the last Or because the whole Or wasn't taken out of the Klippa. The Chet Egel drove it back in the Klippa again. It is the Mashiach Ben Yosef, the Asad Lavoy, that will take out the last of the Or thing. But it's very important to realize this concept. The fundamental of Tachlis of Moshe was to take out the Or of Torah from the Klippa entirely. He only did it halfway. So because of the fact that he only did it halfway, a very strange thing happened. The Torah itself was split into two different surahs. This is very important to understand. The Torah itself was split into two different surahs. When Moshe succeeded in taking the Or Torah out from the Klippa and he gave the Klal Yisrael in the two that we have today, that's called the Torah B'tzuz HaChochma. It's the Torah where he was succeeded in revealing, being Magala, the Chetzonius of the Torah. So we see the Tayyad Mitzvahs in a certain way, you see. But Moshe did not have the Pnimis HaTorah, because he wasn't zoicha to take out the entire Or. So therefore, the Torah now lies in a certain inadequate stage, in a stage where there's a clip on it. That's called the Torah B'tzuz HaChochma. It's Mashiach Ben Yosef at the end who will reveal the entire Torah, which is the Torah B'tzuz HaKesa. But the fact that the Torah is split into these two things, B'tzuz HaChochma and the B'tzuz HaKesa, is only there because of the fact that Moshe failed, Klal Yisrael failed to bring the Gula the first time. This was not the intent of the Bnei Shalom. The Bnei Shalom wanted the Torah, as soon as it was brought out, as soon as the Bnei Shalom gave the Tayyad Mitzvahs, he wanted the Tayyad Mitzvahs to instantly come out B'tzuz HaKesa, where not only did Klal Yisrael understand the halachas of the Tayyad Mitzvahs, but understood the pnimius of the Or, which is behind the Tayyad Mitzvahs, and behind the whole Hashgacha process itself. He wanted Klal Yisrael to understand the thing from Mitchila, right away. But this was not to be. So because of that, the Gil of the Torah was done in two different stages. You see, one stage, B'tzuz HaChochma, where we just understand the Tayyad Mitzvahs and all the halachas, but we don't understand the Uris behind these mitzvahs as such. And that's the Indian of the Erusin of Klal Yisrael, the Kedushin of Klal Yisrael. And then there's the Indian of, what do you call it, of the Nisun of Klal Yisrael, where we understand the Pnimius of the Torah, the Pnimius of the Tayyad Mitzvahs, the Pnimius of the Chukum, the Seder of the Paraduma, the Pnimius of the Hashgacha process itself.